I've spent the last 15 years submerged in philosophy. Book after book, essay upon essay, working through a consistent line of thought. That isn't to say it is unitary. No, I have come out the other side with all sorts of strange beliefs. That nature doesn't mean much, that the orthodoxies of philosophical lineage is a bit of a game, that science and theory have meaningful points of engagement and do not require a subaltern game of big brother, little brother. And it all began with a preoccupation with the concept of materialism, or a question rather. What can philosophy say about the world, about the universe, and about our reality? Generally, the weight of philosophy's responsibility has diminished in rough equivalence with its social effect. To the extent that it has remained meaningful at all, it is through the work of various claimants to the category of materialism and related concepts. Marxian dialectics transformed the maze of Hegel's thought into an investigation of labor, cultural hegemony, and imperialism. Deleuze's transcendental empiricism develops a dynamic ontology of transformation that integrates the timescales of geology, the senses of animals, and all manner of organic and inorganic processes into its consideration of activity. The scientific community produces technical advances and counterintuitive discoveries that modify not only the epistemic register, but also a cosmology that increasingly indicates an inhuman reality extrinsic to consciousness, made explicit through theories of indeterminacy. And finally, in the pragmatism of Dewey, Feyerabend, Postman, and others, the complexity of social life is confronted by practical reasoning about human behavior, the virtual and mechanical systems they produce, and the manifold ways these systems and behaviors are integrated or diverge in practice. These pillars of materialism form a collection of tools that can be used to confront an increasingly opaque and alienated body of knowledge, mores, and expectations that have subordinated human potential for the benefit of a select few. But philosophy is not a smooth thing. It is discontinuous and fragmented, argumentative and contrary, counterintuitive and opaque. At bottom, the theoretical, however abstract, must contend with the substantial political problems that face us in perpetual crisis. The industrial shift into post-Fordist production has altered psychology, and more importantly labor, such that we have reached the moment that Marx warned of, a time where a major portion of the workforce are overseers to technical processes that operate without human engagement. This transforms the labor theory of value, at least in part, and as such requires new demands by labor if we are to contend with the new beasts, as Yeats would call them, that have escaped the widening gyre. Thus, problematics is a methodology for, confrontation of, and perspective on this state of affairs. As the left has become increasingly heterogeneous and fragmented, the prospect of a centralizing ideology has become increasingly ideal as well. Socialist politics remain cut off by the systematic murder and silencing committed by the American government and its allies across the world in the 20th century. Though there are still means of collective action, of party politics, and of substantive consciousness raising, we must maintain both an acute, critical perspective and the means to analytically dissect reality and fabulate a productive sense of the real. This requires a denial of metaphysical orthodoxy that stands in for the cult structures that held communities together in the past. The apparently overwhelming contingency of reason, such that society has accepted a state of shared relativism and solipsism as a rule, indicates that new approaches to organizing and disseminating meaning are necessary. To confront this contingency and chaos within reason, which temporarily coheres into sensibility when a gravitational wave is measured as it moves at 180,000 miles per second, or a new app encodes itself into the behavior of much of the world, it is important to take stock of both the entropic future that we desperately hold off and our reservoir of history with its secrets and contradictions. By attending to the content of scientific theory, both at its most concrete and most abstract, we can tally the wages of knowledge, connecting the powerful counterintuitions of red-shifted images of our early universe, which places the complexity of our plight as one infinity nested within a greater infinity, or the massive index of knowledge that compels a minority toward new understanding of accepted truth, with the intrinsically alienating systems of state and industry. As such, it is important that we resist the urge to treat critique or concept creation, analysis or activism as a universal solution in isolation. If the practice of science, the present arbiter of truth value, teaches us anything, it is that a careful practice of counterinduction, i.e. of returning to knowledge that was considered false or incomplete, and confronting the incommensurability of certain facts, insofar as competing yet sensible arguments may coexist and compel one another, is invaluable to developing points of attack, collective fascination, and renewed ethical imperatives. Despite our political context, reading the signifier for its association of ideas, for its divergent histories, or for its points of factual and iterative reason is not a dire process. At the most imaginative end of our media, we see many attempts at using the counterfactual to imagine alternative possibilities. The anachronistic casting of period dramas, sci-fi alternative histories from Philip K. Dick and comic books adapted to screen, the fantastic open worlds of video games, or the range of historical and futuristic speculations of anime. Though much of this media is determined by the logic of neoliberal ideology, they indicate a threshold of imagination, the degree to which a people can conceive of a world other than their own. And in a singular lineage of art, the works of Marlon Riggs and Roberto Bolaño, Octavia Butler and Shohei Imamura, Adriana Rich and the Art Ensemble of Chicago, there is a more critical sense of myth, cultural content, and human potential. In each we find a mad yet rigorous undermining of expectation, be it the function and history of black and gay people within narrative, the production of new and uncomfortable Japanese myths brimming with repressed sexuality, a recomposition of non-Western musical theory into new forms of improvisation using ancient and non-traditional instruments, imagined futures unmoored to present dynamics of power, or coded revelations of what Rich called the lesbian continuum that subverts the compulsory heterosexuality of dominant society. What becomes necessary for problematic analysis is to read these works against the grain, to draw out conditions of class in the identitarian and the identity out of class, to recognize the limits of past critiques and build upon their force, or to imagine a future that cannot exist within an inexistent narrative future. The more we emphasize the inextricability of cultural identity and class distinction, the better prepared we are to make sense of history at its most granular and difficult to hold. Clearly, narrative and imagination are intrinsic to problematics, but they are just the beginning. Just as speculation allows us to cultivate and challenge the limits of imagination, investigation takes both objects of popular fascination and disavowal and places them on a critical plane to be dissected, reconstructed, and disseminated. For instance, the triad of Reagan, Thatcher, and Deng forms a critical mass through which we can interpret the development of contemporary Europe, the codification of post-Fordist production, and our unipolar economy, the core of neoliberal ideology, and its predation by neo-feudalism. Just as their political activity coincided with and influenced a technical shift in media and communication that both accelerated and obscured the conditions they produced. Similarly, the period between 1968 and 74, which is often ascribed the death of leftism, contains a fraught history of U.S. intervention, the breakup of the civil rights movement into nationalist anarchists, Leninists, Trotskyite, and Maoist factions, the end of the wildcat strike movement through corporate intervention, the détente with China, and the American quagmire in Vietnam. In 1945, Ho Chi Minh left the jungles of Vietnam and visited his urban citizenry for the first time, stating the aims of his movement, saying that they would win independence for their country whatever the cost, so that their children would have enough to eat, would have enough to wear, and could go to school. Minh had already appealed to the American government, telling him that his movement for independence was not at odds with American values. In fact, he looked to the founding fathers as models for his aspirations for Vietnam. But his words fell on deaf ears, as the ideals that he read of in Parisian schools were not real, they were immaterial. Only through a critical cultivation of the past, an archaeology of dense signs filled with sense and potential, can we prepare for the demands of the future. We cannot stop at the fact that algorithms and arbitrary laws have worked in tandem with institutions and assassins to stultify meaningful political change for more than a century. We must cultivate and counter-actualize images, ideas, facts, and actions that may reproduce, though transformed, a new collective energy. We may look to art and science for tendencies and alternatives, but it is only through thought applied to an integrated yet deeply indeterminate world that we will find the will to act. Thank you.